Nvidia's GTX 1060 has a legendary reputation, but that 3GB model got off to a rocky start. But now, 9 years later, is it finally obsolete? Right, so this video is one that people have been asking for a little while now, and it turns out one of the best-selling graphics cards in the UK is actually still the 1063GB. I'm on the CEX website at the moment, and you can see here, they cost £40, which isn't actually too terrible. They tend to go for about that price over on eBay, at least you get the warranty here. But for some reason, the 1060 still carries such a revered name. People are desperate to buy these. Prices on eBay are insane. That RX 580 was 20 quid. Yet this is nearly in the £40 region. Don't get me wrong, you can pick them up for about £30 if you're lucky, but I've never come across one that's actually reasonable to buy. But I've got a hold of one because I've got to know, is there something the people that are buying these know that we don't? But let's get this open and see what's actually inside. And I'm not ill, I just went to a concert. We're finally in. We got in here. That's a Sandy Bridge Core i7. That's not what we're talking about today. That's a project for later. But I'm assuming in here is our 1060. It's not a bad version by the looks of things. It's just a normal gigabyte 1060 Windforce Overclocked Edition 3GB. It's just odd to see it's such a best-selling graphics card still. Because, I mean, I'm sure I'll get into it later because I do ramble when I make these videos. But the 1060 3GB, it's not the RAM that annoys me. It's something else about these. But let's plug in a PC, just double check it turns on. We'll see if this thing works. I mean, more than anything, I'm curious on the benchmarks. Just a little bit of dirt that's built up here, so it might need a repaste or something. It doesn't look too egregious, and I don't think these are that power hungry. But yeah, there's a huge part of the market that wants these over the RX 480 and the RX 580, which just seems absolutely ridiculous to me. I just thought, you know what, while I'm getting a hold of one, why don't we see what they're actually capable of? Because people have got to want these for a reason. I suppose the one thing they do have going for them is power efficiency, but even then, it's not like the RX 580 and 480 series. Well, as we've seen from my testing, you can undervolt them to actually be rather power efficient. I suppose for the average person, just seeing the requirement of one 6-pin, maybe that's enough to convince them, but we'll plug this in anyway and see what all the fuss is about. I didn't expect after so long for this to be one of the best-selling graphics cards. I know they were good at the time. That time has long since sailed. I suppose the fact that Nvidia is still supporting these better than AMD is might be making a degree of difference, but I can't imagine it making a huge deal of difference. I suppose the Nvidia brand name also has a lot to carry. People that want a graphics card, and probably have heard people mention CEX or eBay, have typed in graphics cards, and you see these pop up all the time. eBay is full of them, going for £40 to £50, even just for the 3GB version. So point one, of course, will be getting some drivers. So when was our last driver? November 4th. Start of the month, there were drivers for the 1060. Now, I know when it comes to drivers and AMD, there's been a lot of controversy going around with them trying to drop support for the 6000 series. But at the end of the day, one thing that it is worth remembering, I do believe some people forget, is with so many games now utilising Vulkan or DirectX 12, a large portion of the optimization is meant to be done by the developers of the game, and all the drivers there to do is to provide bug fixes that are card dependent. So as long as you get bug fixes with the card, generally you're not in for too bad of a time. Now, a lot of these cards do function best on DirectX 11 still, if that's an option, specifically these Pascal cards and prior. It is just a tricky one though, isn't it? Because, I mean, our testing of the RX 480 and RX 580 this year, even the sketchy ones that didn't really work, showed that they were excellent cards going in bargain bin prices. Whereas these, you do still see the occasional video on the 1060, but not a lot of people seem to acknowledge that the price is nearly double that of the AMD competition if you're being clever on eBay. I mean, a lot of the purchases I make on this channel are either a CEX bargain, something cheap on Marketplace, or an eBay auction. But I have followed countless auctions for the 1060, and I can go through my eBay watch list. I'll probably put a couple of the options I bid on up on screen. And for the money they go for, they just don't seem to be great value. I've seen them go for £50 to £60 sometimes. And I just bought a Vega 56 for £56, which is another tier above these. That is still sitting outside in my pile of bits that I've been meaning to get round to. We've got plenty coming across this month and the Christmas period, but we'll get these downloaded, make sure these install. I'm just a bit bewildered. Is there something that we don't know? Are these aging better? Because yeah, 3 gigs of VRAM's not great, but my main issue is the cut down cores. It's not getting hot at all though, it is staying dead cold, but it's Also not really having to do anything at all anymore at the moment anyway. Well, I think what's next to do is to run 3D Mark real quick and get ourselves a baseline figure. We're currently running the latest drivers, so we should be all set up, working and ready to go to actually find out how this performs. Now, that's actually surprisingly good performance, about 27, 28 FPS in Time Spy from the get-go. So performance out of the box isn't too bad. I'd imagine that sort of orange mark is all your OEM ones bringing down the sort of performance, but 1063GB scoring a great score out of the box. Yeah, that's really not terrible. We'll run it through Firestrike as well, see how it does here, and then I think we get started on some overclocking. I mean, we're not going to call it a tutorial because it'll probably be... I know that things get a little bit funky with boost clocks, but, you know, it's a bit of fun. We can see if we can get any extra performance out of it. Why not? Now, once again, I did actually film an entire section talking about overclocking the graphics card, and as you can probably tell now, my voice is back to being absolutely fine. But the thing is, it's not all too entertaining, the actual overclock on these cards. See, whereas I left it in for the RX 580 we looked at a few weeks ago, at least that sort of served a purpose, showing you how to undervolt the card and how there was free performance on the table with less thermals and less power consumption. But the thing is, Nvidia's Pascal pretty much came out of the box damn near perfect, and the reason for that is because these cards pretty much boost as high as they can go given the current limitations available to them, without having a load of voltage plugged into them at stock settings. I mean, there is a little bit of wiggle room here on certain cards. We really lucked out with the memory on this one, as we were able to get quite a hefty overclock to the stage where we had it running at 1000 MHz higher when we made it through the Unigine Valley benchmark. But the problem is, this isn't exactly a very RAM intensive benchmark, so it survived for about 5 to 10 minutes, which was quite impressive, before it would eventually crash. But it lets us see that we do actually have some good memory on the chip. Either way, we did manage to get a fairly decent overclock, but it was mostly memory, as the core clocks, we got an extra 100 MHz, I think a little bit over that in the end. But honestly, with the way these cards are set up and how the boost clocks on them work, you're just going to get a few extra points here or there on the cores. I have to give Nvidia credit. These cards are pretty much set up perfectly from the factory, which really isn't something that you get with AMD's Polaris cards. But still, what were the results of that overclock? Now, I did run through a couple of benchmarks, Firestrike and Time Spy. For the sake of it actually being a modern set of benchmarking, we are just going to look at the Time Spy figures here, but straight out of the box we saw figures that returned 3,928, which is actually quite a respectable score out of the box, but there was a little bit of extra performance available on the table. With a light overclock, mostly to the memory and not touching the core, we boosted up to 4,172 just by seeing if we could get things up a little bit. When I tried to push things even further, given how good the card seemed and trying to bump up the core until it wouldn't crash, we saw an overclocked score of 4,243. Now, those are some semi-respectable increases, but honestly, it's not the kind of huge gains that you get from an RX 480 or RX 580 by undervolting the card and tweaking with things there. That's when you really see some notable improvements. Here, it was just a nice little boost in performance that you wouldn't get otherwise, and didn't take too long to do. When we actually compare these results with other cards on the market, I've thrown a few up into a graph here, we see that even with its full overclock, well, it's still not coming quite close to the AMD RX 580, but then again, it was also never competing with that card on launch. The main thing is, though, now that these cards are getting on a bit, the RX 580 is now as cheap, if not cheaper than this card, and pretty much its main competition on the used market. I've included the AMD Radeon 780M in there to show how a modern iGPU performs, and then I've included a couple of oddballs that are similar in price, like the RTX 4010 we bought, which was a weird scam card from China, the GTX 1630 that serves absolutely no purpose and does actually sell for the same price as a 1060, and an RTX 2080 Super, mostly because it's actually one of the best flagship cards that you can pick up cheap at the moment, and is substantially better than a 1060 is, at least on paper. So it gives you a rough idea of how these cards compare around, but the 1060 did well. With an overclock, it's pretty much up there with a tuned RX 580, and really, it's just a margin of difference in points between them. So the 1060's looking good on paper, despite being the cut down 3GB model. But when I say the GTX 1060 is cut down, what exactly do I mean? Well, when Nvidia came out with the 1060 in two versions, the 3GB and the 6GB, the main issue at the time was never the VRAM, because at the time most games weren't really using 3GB of VRAM, and you're going to see that in the benchmarks with some of the older titles. But what did make a difference to the performance was the fact that it saw itself having cut down cores. So as much as the other specifications line up, you've got a 16nm Pascal-based GP106 processor, 3GB of GDDR5 VRAM, a 192-bit memory bus, which is nice to see and larger than you'd expect, with drivers that are still getting security and bug fixes on both sides. The big difference comes down here, where we now have 1152 CUDA cores compared to the full 1280 of the full unit. ROPs are also cut down a little bit from 72 from 80, TMU's the same, but you get the idea. The main controversy of this card, at least on launch, some people did notice the VRAM, but it wasn't a huge conversation point at the time. 3GB was passable back in 2016. So the idea that what you were getting was the same card with the same name, but the lower VRAM version also has lower specs, meant that it did show up noticeably worse in certain benchmarks. Today, though, they both find themselves in an odd spot in the market, where it's really the reputation and the goodwill towards these cards means that even this cut-down 3GB version is selling anywhere from £35 up to £45. Really, I've been generous with that top-end figure, because I've seen some versions of these in box sell for £60. Which is ridiculous money for the amount of power you're getting, but once again, maybe they know something that we don't. But you've got to remember, I'm not someone that's used the GTX 1060 before. A lot of what I know of this card is pure speculation and what I've heard other people say. You know, the usual, 3GB of VRAM's not enough. The 3GB version's too cut down to actually be a good purchase. And for what I know a rough idea on the performance, I know how they should be performing, but you sort of just take people's word as gospel when they sort of preach about VRAM and cut down cores and say the 1060's no good. Well, from my understanding, I think it's a bit overpriced. But the moment I launched my first game on it, which was GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, I thought, you know what, we'll be reserved about this. We're going to run the game with just high textures and turn up some of the other settings to give the card a chance. And it just ran too well. We were seeing about 90 to 120 FPS in 1080p. So I thought, well, hang on a second here. What if we turn everything up to very high settings? And it was still running at about 60 to 90 FPS in 1080p. So I thought, what if we turn up the resolution? What if we move things up to 1440p? And it ran perfectly. So it gave me a rough ballpark already of, oh, although the 1060's cut down, and this is the lower VRAM version, well, maybe the performance is better than some people think it's going to be, myself included. This really caught me off guard, genuinely. But anyway, with all of that little rant and ramble out of the way, is this GTX 1060, the 3GB version, obsolete? Or is it actually a little gem that people just are still buying because it's got that name? Well, there's only one way to find out, and that is in the benchmarks. So, starting off with GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which was running with very high settings in 1440p, as you've just heard, and we saw a rather remarkable 54 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 47 FPS. Now, this caught me off guard for a couple of reasons, because now at least we know that GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, well, its VRAM slider is just as obnoxious as it was in the original Legacy version, because it tends to think you're going to need quite a lot more VRAM than it actually uses, even with these very high settings in 1440p. Now, the only time the framerate ever strayed remotely away from the 50 to 60 FPS territory was when there was lots of chaos and lots going on screen. It actually dealt with DirectX 12 better than I thought it would, delivering actually results similar to that of an RX 580. Now, was the RX 580 better here? Yes. Was the RX 580 cheaper? Yes. But can the 1060 deal with it? Well, also yes, in a way that I had been led to believe that it just couldn't. Of course, a 1080p frame rate will return even better frames than this.
Moving things back to the legacy version of the game, and you've got to give this card credit, this is exactly what it was always intended for. The performance in DirectX 11 and older API-based titles is admittedly fantastic on Nvidia's Pascal architecture, so the card does perform noticeably better than even cards like an RX 580 that have been undervolted and things like that. You can't deny, these cards deal with this game well, and it is the most popular way to play this game. The old school legacy version here, with very high settings, once again in 1440p, running with an average of 80 FPS and 1% lows down to 61 FPS. Now, the Nvidia magic in their drivers, and I know I went on a little bit of a tangent in the live section earlier, they deal with this API so well, and the amount of driver-side optimizations they provide just return you an excellent frame rate. So it did actually feel smoother to run on a 1060 here than it felt for me on an RX 580. So you've got to give it credit where it's due. But a big challenge for these cards is GTA Online, and one of the things we usually notice is that depending on the card, the drivers, and a varying amount of factors, once you go over 16 players, you are in for a bit of an interesting time when it comes to utilization and how the card actually performs. So this benchmark was actually done about 5 hours after the other benchmarks were done, because I couldn't find a fully populated lobby. So eventually, when I came back to it and was able to get a fully populated lobby, we saw that the game ran with 66 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 57 FPS. There were issues with utilization and fluctuating VRAM amounts. I'd imagine that as this game's got heavier, the amount of VRAM required for over 16 players has also increased. Who knows? The optimization on this game when you're over 16 players is a mystery, and the black bag of optimization and tricks and magic all goes out the window. It's just random on whether or not it'll run well or utilize the card. Utilization did drop, not as much as I thought it would, but not as well as I thought it could perform. So GTA Online Legacy's perfect, but it did run now worse than the RX card. So it could be VRAM, it could be drivers, who really knows with this game. But BeamNG is a big one. It's not only a very well optimized title, it's also one that looks great, but also does like to use a lot of VRAM and system RAM. Not that we're focusing too much on the system RAM today. Either way, the game defaulted to high settings in 1080p, which did return us a fairly decent experience. In the most intensive of maps with the jungle map, we saw 53 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 44 FPS. This is by no means bad whatsoever at all, because this was about what I expected from the card. Higher settings than this would pretty much tear the card apart because of its lack of VRAM, so I'd imagine the 6GB version could see you net a few options up to ultra settings or a higher resolution. But as far as things go, you're still playing the game with high settings in 1080p here. Now, this one I had no hope for. I think one of the reasons why Oblivion Remastered asks you for 6GB of VRAM in the first place is because how popular the more powerful version of this card is. But I thought, you know what, we tried this game on low VRAM cards and you just don't get any budge on it. But there was actually a degree of performance here. It wasn't great, and it did involve us using low settings in 540p, but we were able to get 30 FPS on average. It wasn't a stable 30 FPS, even with a cap in place, and I think that is purely down to the fact that this card, it was never designed to run things like Oblivion Remastered. But it is, and it is almost playable. It's not the most stable frame rate in the world, but with it capped at 30 FPS, it is responsive enough that you can enjoy and play the game. Just, it doesn't look too great. This was also another interesting one with Cyberpunk 2077, and I used these same settings that I've used on the competing AMD RX cards, and we did see a fairly decent frame rate overall, with medium and high settings and low textures enabled. Genuinely, the game looks pretty good like this, so if you are playing on a lower VRAM card like this, you can still make it look pretty good and mask how some of those textures look with fancier settings turned on medium and high. With a 1080p resolution, we saw 37 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 31 FPS. But as we know, sometimes the built-in benchmark can be highly deceptive. But the thing is, it ran pretty much exactly the same in the benchmark as it did in-game. So you can play through Cyberpunk 2077, which is quite an intensive and good looking game, on even this little 3GB 1060. Once again, I feel like I have to mention RX side performance from AMD, given it's cheaper and its main competition on the used market. Yes, the RX cards are better, but this one, it's not too dissimilar. Counter-Strike 2 did run as well as I thought it would. You've got to remember this game is going to be targeting cards just like this, and best of all, it's a DirectX 11 title, so it's going to run well on this architecture anyway. I don't doubt there is a ton of optimizations done in the driver set purely to ensure that performance here is good. Either way, with competitive settings in 1080p, we saw 168 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 129 FPS. And this was during the built-in workshop benchmark map, which can prove remarkably more intensive than actual gameplay. People do always ask me to test some offline gameplay, usually in one of the newer maps like Nuke, just to see if this translates well to actual gameplay, and I can confirm to you that yeah, actual gameplay Counter-Strike 2 works perfectly fine here. I don't have the exact figures on hand for the RX card for this, but I want to say it was very similar. So Counter-Strike 2, doesn't matter if you're running on a 1060 or the RX card, both are going to be pretty good, but the RX cards are cheaper. Next up we have a popular request with Rust, which defaulted to medium settings in 1080p, and given how finicky this game can be to change the settings around on, I was just hoping that it got it right. And through a mixture of gameplay and once again the rather comprehensive built-in benchmark, we saw it return a 51 FPS average, with 1% lows down to 43 FPS. Now it's worth keeping in mind it didn't matter whether you were loading into a server or loading into the game's built-in benchmark, there were some momentary hitches and stutters which would take a few minutes to calm down. I've noticed when I've tested this game before that on higher VRAM cards this is a lot less noticeable, so I'm going to say this is a side effect of running the medium settings with only 3GB of VRAM. However, after the game had stabilised down, well, this pretty much went away entirely. So Rust was pretty much playable, but then you'd expect it to be, given how popular this card still is. Mount & Blade Bannerlord is an excellently optimised title that we've seen run on plenty of cards and run very well. But here I was a little bit skeptical as its own default settings put it over the estimated amount of VRAM that we were going to be using. Honestly, I don't usually talk about VRAM this much in benchmarks, but it seems quite apparent given that this 1060 is so reviled in parts of the tech community, more so for its VRAM than its cut down cores. But once again we saw that it had absolutely no problems running through the benchmark with this combination of settings, returning 85 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 63 FPS, all in a 1080p resolution. Now it's also worth noting that this benchmark is very reminiscent of the late game, so during earlier parts of the game you'd see this frame rate somewhere in the 100 to 150 FPS range, so Mount & Blade Bannerlord runs perfectly on a 1060, even the 3GB version. Just to gauge how this card deals with DirectX 10 titles, we have Tomb Raider here running with DirectX 10.1. Now, DirectX 9, 10 and 10.1 really do tend to be siding in AMD's favour, especially on a lot of the newer cards where I've noticed a few problems on some of the Nvidia side cards, but here on the 1060, well, no problems whatsoever, even with ultimate settings in 1080p. Now, it's no surprise we're seeing 112 FPS on average here, with 1% lows down to 90 FPS. This is an older title running on an older API, but it's an API that I've always found a little bit questionable on some Nvidia cards. But still, great performance, great visuals. For those older titles, it does appear to be that the 1060, well, it runs them absolutely fine. I've heard people criticise its ability to run older titles. I have no idea why, because I've not run into any issues just yet, but Tomb Raider, well, it's a good benchmark for those sort of late 2000s titles. One of my least favourite games to benchmark though, but one that people always love to see, is Red Dead Redemption 2, which I will say is a nightmare to configure on this card for one simple reason. It has the world's worst VRAM slider. That's right, we're talking about VRAM again, because you cannot make the game ignore the requirements it has. So I had to restart the game out 3 times to set it to a mixture of medium and high, which is what it defaulted to. That's sort of on the built-in slider. I wasn't going around changing settings, so a lot of them were on high or ultra, lots of the others were on medium. It's quite good at configuring itself down. That's not the point. What you need to know is, when you eventually do get the game to launch in 1080p, yes, that was a bit of a problem here, we did actually see a good frame rate with 42 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 37 FPS even in built-up areas. So Red Dead Redemption 2 runs well, looks pretty good as well, and there's not really any problems to report on here. Next up, we have an Atanian member's choice with Deep Rock Galactic, so thank you very much again, Laney, for your continued support, and here it ran pretty much fantastically. Now, I try and do this benchmark in an area with heavy action and lots going on, with very high settings and the experimental high options turned on as well, and we were also utilising DirectX 12 in a 1080p resolution. We saw 64 FPS on average, with really stable frame times with 1% lows down to 54 FPS. There weren't all too many problems, and honestly, when not much was going on, the frame rate was over double this. So Deep Rock Galactic works fantastically, and honestly, it's a pretty good member's choice benchmark there. We're not testing City Skylines 2 here because most people, every time I test it, comment, can you just test the original? They all prefer it. So here we have the original City Skylines running with high settings in 1080p. And it must be said, this game has always been a bit of an optimization nightmare. I don't think it's a particularly great looking game, and I'm quite the fan of city builders, which is why there's so much footage here, but at the same time, even with these settings in 1080p with the game looking mediocre, we only saw 51 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 37 FPS while we were entirely GPU bound. It's worth noting that if you look in the top left corner and see the amount of VRAM we're using, even in a small benchmark city like this, we are already maxing out the entire 3 GB. So City Skylines 1 will work, but once again, it's just not a great looking game, but you can enjoy it here. It's very rare that we actually get to see Baldur's Gate 3 run properly without any frame pacing issues or problems, given the AMD side seems to have very few driver optimizations for DirectX 11 and some frequent crashes on Vulkan unless you're running the game on Linux. But here, on the Nvidia side of things, Baldur's Gate 3 runs fantastically. Medium and high settings in 1080p returned as 49 FPS on average, with incredibly stable frame times, 1% lows down to 46 FPS. It's got to be said here that if this is a game you're looking to play, well, the 1060, at least in terms of the playability of the game, maybe not the overall average, the average was higher on an RX card, but the actual experience was smoother on a GTX 1060, even the 3GB version. So I had to give a win where it's deserved because Baldur's Gate 3, I think it is an Nvidia sponsored title, which would probably explain why, does run perfect even on these rather old entry-level Nvidia cards. Now this one, we always love seeing Fallout 4 because we never know how it's going to run, and it detected our settings with a mixture of high and ultra settings in 1080p. And for once, it actually worked. I have no idea why. I've tested this game on similar age Nvidia cards, and I didn't get performance like this out of it. But Fallout 4, on the exact setup we are using here today, achieved a locked 60 FPS with some settings on ultra. I don't know how to explain this, I don't think it is explainable, but it works. So it turns out that maybe the ideal card for Fallout 4 is possibly a GTX 1060. It works really well here. But yes, Fallout 4 was perfect, no arguments about that, and it was nice to actually see the game running smoothly without any frame drop stutters or pacing problems. But finally, the Achilles heel of all modern Nvidia cards, or at least those that are still receiving up-to-date drivers, Crysis. And can it run it? Well, yes, with high settings in DirectX 9, you can't actually launch DirectX 10 on these cards, at least not with workarounds. I think there's a few workarounds out there, maybe we'll try them in the future. But for now, as it stands, Crysis will launch with high settings in DirectX 9 and return a great frame rate until you get the good old shader error screen, which still makes me laugh. Certain Nvidia cards do it on later driver versions, and the GTX 1060 is one of them. So you'll get a great frame rate, but with one of the more lacking APIs, so you can't use ultra settings here. So you can play Crysis. It's going to be an interesting experience with that shading error that occurs. I've tried fixing it before, but it's definitely a driver-side problem, and one that Nvidia should know about by now, given that DirectX 10 hasn't worked for what, about a year and a half now? Anyway, Crysis will work, just you can have a good chuckle at the shader errors while you're playing it. So how is the performance of the GTX 1060 3GB overall in 2025? Like, what are my actual thoughts on it? Well, performance out of the box is excellent. I've got no problems with the performance here. In fact, I'm a little bit blown away, because I've heard tons of people complaining about the 3GB version in particular. Oh, the VRAM's not enough. Oh, the cut down cores are a problem. There's so many issues with it. There just aren't. There is a reason why this card is still so popular, especially on the used market today. You can whack this into just any system, and I hate to say it, it just works. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some limitations to this. Crysis having problems, and a few older titles definitely having some driver-side related issues. If you are running the latest and greatest up-to-date drivers, chances are if you're using this card, you've bought it, just downloaded the drivers from the Nvidia website, and you don't want to go tracing back driver versions that will work with older titles. That is a problem. But out of the box, all the most popular titles out there want to work. All the games people actually want to play still work. Competitive modern titles like Counter-Strike 2 work absolutely fine. There is no problem with the GTX 1060's 3GB performance if you are simply building a PC to play the games that people are actually playing. Now, don't get me wrong, it is a low VRAM card, and as we've seen, as much as you can tweak Unreal Engine 5 down in certain instances, there is only so much you can do when it comes to the VRAM requirements. And 3GB? Well, it's limiting your resolution to 540p in titles like Oblivion Remastered, which is a shame because, once again, it is the great filter of graphics cards. Can it handle Unreal Engine 5? Does it have the VRAM amount for it? And does it have the out-and-out API support to actually ensure that they run smoothly? And unfortunately, the 1060 just doesn't meet the cutoff here. I don't think it's so much the API support so much as it is the VRAM, because 3GB is just cutting it too short. It did an admirable job, given that we've tested this on 4GB VRAM cards, and they couldn't run the game hardly at all. So I'll give it credit there, but at the same time it does look like it's going to struggle going forward if it is running titles that have rather lacking optimizations. Because they are lacking optimizations. How can it run Cyberpunk 2077 that looks amazing, yet Oblivion Remastered is stuck in 540p? Does make you think sometimes, doesn't it? But another great selling point for this card is, as I said, it works great out of the box. And yes, I do think it's overpriced, but you can't argue with the fact that this thing, well, it seems to run all games out there, and the architecture is just so inherently efficient that it is doing all of this, and I've got the power consumption figures, with stock settings at 121 watts, while overclocked, which is what the benchmarks were, at 132. And you're going to notice a third graph there, underclocked. I wanted to know just how little power we could make this thing consume. Now you've got to keep in mind, these are from a Furmark stress test, running for 20 minutes at a time. This is like running a power virus on the graphics card to get these figures. In reality, when you're actually gaming, unless you are stressing the card out to 100%, it doesn't actually achieve these full figures, it is lower than this. And you know the best bit about it, those underclocked figures, just what can this card do at 50 watts? Well, I didn't want to go through and re-benchmark it all completely just to see what it could do for power efficiency, because I already know the architecture's power efficient. But at the same time, I wanted to see what happens if we just give it an underclock, limit the power, see what we can do when this card is using sub 50 watts. Well, it can actually still play GTA 5 Enhanced Edition with the high/very high preset and return 60 FPS in 1080p in a 50 watt power envelope. Yes, there are some frame pacing issues, which is likely because I didn't fix all the boost clocks and things like that. This was a very crude way of doing this test, but it was just my own curiosity. What if you drag a couple of sliders and you think, how power efficient can this card actually be? Well, turns out you can get pretty great power efficiency and great performance on something that, in reality, is pulling most of its power from the PCIe lane, which is very, very impressive to see. So I have to give the GTX 1060 credit there. It really is a graphics card that you can whack into any system, and unlike its competing AMD RX cards, you're not going to be undervolting it to make sure your cheap power supply doesn't explode. Because let's be honest, if you're buying cards in this territory, chances are they're going into a pre-built or something with a lackluster power supply. Now, there are going to be some people watching this video and actually going, you know what, I'm actually considering a GTX 1060 now. And as much as I would rather go for the AMD RX card, well, as we've seen, it does seem to be selling because it works fine out of the box. So I did go through and test Nvidia's NVENC, which is the built-in video encoder, and I do have to admit it does return excellent quality results with H.264 or HEVC. So yes, you can use this as a media center card, but it's more of an afterthought. I wouldn't exactly go and buy this card for its media center properties. Personally, for me, Intel seems to be the ones that are killing it there when it comes to media center efficiency and purpose, because lots of my encoding is done on Intel equipment. It's one thing they're really good for. But still, at the same time, if it's included with your card, you might as well use it. So yes, you can record, you can stream. The streaming seems to be worse than AMD, but the overall recording quality seems to be better than AMD. There's very little between them when it comes to hardware encoding, so especially in this price point, we're talking about the sub £50 region. So yes, Nvidia NVENC does work, you can get some okay quality captures. You're probably better off doing it through OBS rather than Shadowplay like I'm doing here, but to me, the quality seemed absolutely fine, and you can get some decent quality results out of it. Trust me, they look better before they're being compressed and edited into another video. Well, there we have it, Nvidia's GTX 1060 3GB, and honestly, I'm quite impressed. Now, I really do disagree with the price people are paying on these. As I showed in the start of the video, you scroll through eBay and there are people bidding even this 3GB version up into the £50 to £60 region if they come with a box, because of the reputation they've got. Now, if you're spending that kind of money, just buy the next tier of card above. You can start getting GTX 1070s, Vega 56s, Vega 64s. I've got videos on those coming at some point, but the point remains. I think this is a good card, especially if you can get it for the £30 to even £40 region. If you are giving this card to someone that just wants something that's going to work, they don't want to tweak with voltages, they don't want to do things like that, because the out-of-the-box experience here is undeniably better than AMD's Polaris. But I was one of these people that said this, about 9 years ago when this came out? I was saying, well, I quite like the Polaris cards, but it's a shame that AMD stuck so much voltage in them from the factory, because it just needs tweaking a little bit to get the best performance out of it. Whereas these, as we've seen, you can overclock them, there's not much point doing it, you gain a couple of frames and a few extra points in 3D Mark, because these work so well out of the box. Do I think £40 is unfair for a 3GB model? Yes. Do I think £50 to £70 for a 6GB model is unfair? I wouldn't even begin to comprehend paying it, which is why we've not looked at it. But there are people out there buying these. And the 3GB version, why? Because they're cheap, and it's got the 1060 name. So I don't think I want to really hate on the card, because it does what it always set out to do. It lets you play all the games you want to play by plugging it in and playing them. You don't have to tweak, you don't have to mess around with it, it just works. At the same time, don't pay too much for one of these, please. Just get an RX card, because it's going to be a lot cheaper than one of these is. It's not a bad card, it's a good card, but you can start picking up the AMD equivalent for £10 to £20 less. And when you're dealing with this price point, that means something. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts on the 1060. I think I've given it a fairly balanced and honest review, because I wanted to cut through some of the pessimism and look through this optimistically. Because yes, I disagree with the price, but you can't deny that is still a quality card. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and good night.